Imagine you walk into the boardroom of like a massive modern tech company today.
Okay.
You sit down across from the CEO and you tell them that running this multi-billion-dollar business shouldn't actually be about um, profit or market share
Right.
or even efficiency. Instead, you suggest it should just be this noble, gentlemanly hobby, like a leisurely pursuit reserved strictly for the elite.
You would be politely, or, well, probably not so politely escorted out of the building.
Exactly.
I mean, it completely contradicts the basic mechanics of how any functioning organization operates today.
Right. It sounds totally absurd to us, but if you look at the historical records, that aristocratic, gentlemanly ideal was, exactly how American politics operated in the early days of the Republic.
Yeah, the Founding Fathers actively despised the idea of political parties.
They really did. They operated under this incredibly lofty assumption that once the major constitutional issues were settled, everyone would just sort of inherently agree on the best course of action.
Which is a beautiful philosophical theory. But in practice, a rapidly expanding, highly diverse nation doesn't run on philosophical theories.
No, it doesn't.
It requires a functioning engine.
And that brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking a uniquely American story.
A really fascinating one.
Yeah, it's a genuinely patriotic success story, honestly, about how a fragile young republic was kept intact. We're pulling from an amazing stack of sources today.
We've got historical biographies, some great essays from the Miller Center.
Right, plus records from the National Park Service, and this really incredible Smithsonian analysis.
There's a lot to dig into.
There is. And we're looking at a man who was the very first U.S. president actually born an American citizen.
Right, rather than a British subject.
Exactly. A tavern keeper's son with zero formal college education who completely dismantled that old gentleman's club of the founders.
He really did.
He became the absolute architect of the modern political party system. We were talking of the 8th president of the United States, Martin Van Buren.
And his legacy is just so often misunderstood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at standard historical overviews, he's sometimes reduced to a single term in office. Or, mocked for his distinct hairstyle.
Wild sideburns.
Right, the mutton chops.
Yeah.
But to focus on that is to miss his actual contribution. Van Buren wasn't just a politician who occupied the presidency.
Right.
He was the inventor of the political machine. He recognized that the United States was growing way too fast to survive on the informal rules of the revolutionary generation.
Which is wild because if you look at his resume, you really wouldn't bet on him to be the guy who professionalizes American democracy.
Not at all.
He was born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York. His family ran a tavern and a farm.
Right.
They were second-generation Dutch Americans, and the biographies we're referencing point out this really fascinating detail. He's the only president for whom English was a second language.
That's right. They spoke Dutch at the dinner table.
That's just so uniquely American.
It is. And that tavern setting is crucial context.
Yeah.
A tavern in late 18th century New York wasn't just, a place to get a drink.
Right, it was like the town square.
Exactly. It was the civic center. It was where travelers brought news, where local disputes were aired, where elections were debated.
So he's soaking all this in.
Right. He essentially received his early political education by sweeping floors and just listening to how average people actually talked about their needs and grievances.
But he still desperately wanted a formal education, right? He was a brilliant kid and had his sights set on Columbia College.
He did.
But his father suffered financial ruin. Young Martin had to totally abandon his college plans and go straight to work as a law clerk.
Which was a massive blow.
Yeah, and the Smithsonian analysis we are looking at today highlights that this rejection left him with a lifelong sense of intellectual inferiority.
Oh, absolutely.
He revered the formal learning he was denied.
Which serves as this really powerful psychological driver. I mean, think about it. In a political arena dominated by Harvard and Yale graduates,
Right.
or men with prestigious family names and military glory, how does a tavern keeper's son compete?
He can't rely on pedigree.
Exactly. So he compensates by outworking, out-strategizing, and out-organizing everyone else in the room.
He builds an entirely new pathway to power.
Yes. He creates what becomes known as the Albany Regency. It's the very first statewide political machine in America.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because I want to test the modern analogy on you.
Sure, go for it.
Did Van Buren essentially invent, like, the startup or franchise model of politics?
Oh, that's interesting.
Because if we think about how a fast food franchise works, standardizing the product, So it's exactly the same whether you're in New York or Georgia.
Yeah.
Is that what he was doing with political ideology?
It's close to a franchise model, but unlike a business selling a standardized product, Van Buren was dealing in human ambition.
Okay.
The currency he traded in wasn't money, it was patronage.
Ah, right. Trading favors.
Exactly. The Albany Regency operated by strictly trading jobs in the executive branch, like local postmaster positions or customs officials for votes in the legislature.
Wow.
So he wasn't just standardizing a message, he was standardizing loyalty. And he made those bargains stick through really strict party discipline.
He was literally professionalizing the operation.
Yep.
There's a quote from Van Buren where he argues that politics shouldn't be a hobby for gentlemen. It should be run by professionals.
Yes. And we have to understand why that mattered to the actual survival of the country.
Right.
Van Buren realized something profound about the geography of America. He saw that to hold a massive, diverse, and frankly heavily divided country together, you couldn't just rely on the personal charisma of individual leaders.
It's too fragile.
Exactly. You needed what he called party principle rather than just personal preference.
Okay, so the system is bigger than the person.
Right, because if everyone votes strictly based on their local geographic interests, the young country fractures. But if you have a structured national party platform, it smooths over those regional differences. It keeps the country glued together.
That structural insight is brilliant.
Yeah.
But taking this New York franchise national presented a problem.
A big problem.
Van Buren was a brilliant tactician, but he wasn't exactly a magnetic rock star. Like, his voice didn't boom across a crowded room.
No, he was actually quite soft-spoken.
Right. So he knew he needed a national figurehead to ride to the top. So he hitches his wagon to the ultimate American celebrity of the era, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans.
Jackson had the immense emotional, popular appeal that Van Buren lacked.
The ultimate tough guy.
Yeah, but Jackson was also incredibly volatile.
Oh, yeah.
So Van Buren steps in to manage that energy. He helps organize Jackson's successful 1828 presidential campaign, effectively merging his New York political machine with Jackson's Southern appeal.
And his reward is being appointed Secretary of State.
Exactly. And he quickly becomes Jackson's closest confidant. I mean, they would take these daily horseback rides at 3:30 p.m. just to hash out the nation's business.
Set the two of them riding around Washington.
Yeah.
But just having the president's ear wasn't enough because Washington was absolutely paralyzed by palace intrigue.
It really was.
Which brings us to one of the most remarkable dramas in American political history, the Peggy Eaton affair.
Oh, this is such a wild story.
It is. So the Secretary of War, John Eaton, marries a woman named Peggy who has this controversial social history.
Right.
There are rumors about her previous marriage, whispers of impropriety, and the wives of Washington's elite, led by the vice president's wife, absolutely refuse to socialize with her.
To a modern listener, a social boycott sounds like, trivial gossip.
Right, like high school drama.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in 19th century Washington, social events were the primary infrastructure of government. The dinners and the parlor meetings were where legislation was negotiated and alliances were formed. So by boycotting Peggy Eaton, these cabinet wives were effectively stalling the function of the executive branch.
That is crazy. And Van Buren, who is a widower with no wife dictating his social calendar, sees an incredible tactical opening.
He really does.
He aggressively goes out of his way to socialize with Peggy Eaton. He hosts elaborate parties for her. He treats her with the utmost public respect.
Right.
And President Jackson, whose own late wife had suffered terribly from vicious political gossip, watches this happen. And Jackson forms an absolute, unbreakable personal loyalty to Van Buren.
It is a masterclass in reading the room, and more importantly, reading the president.
Totally.
But Van Buren knows he still has a problem. The rest of the cabinet is packed with men loyal to Vice President John C. Calhoun.
And Calhoun desperately wants the presidency for himself.
Right. So Van Buren orchestrates this maneuver to clear the board entirely.
He goes to Jackson and offers his own resignation as Secretary of State.
Yes. He convinces Jackson that the only way to heal the fractured administration is if he, Van Buren, falls on his sword and steps down.
Which seems crazy at first glance.
Right. But the unstated mechanism here is that by resigning, he forces the hand of the Calhoun loyalists in the cabinet.
Ah.
They are pressured to resign as well to allow the president to form a fresh administration. It completely purges Calhoun's influence from the executive branch.
Just a brilliant chess move. And the way Calhoun tries to get revenge is straight out of a political thriller.
It really is. What's fascinating here is how Calhoun's plan backfires.
Right, so Jackson tries to reward Van Buren by appointing him Minister Britain,
Yes.
but it requires Senate confirmation. Calhoun, as vice president, presides over the Senate. He actually orchestrates a tie vote among the senators on purpose, just so he can cast the tie-breaking vote to publicly deny Van Buren the job.
Yeah, Calhoun believed he was dealing a fatal blow to Van Buren's career.
But he was wrong.
He fundamentally misunderstood the machine Van Buren had built. The local party organizations across the country saw this as a massive elitist injustice against a loyal party man.
Right, it looks like bullying.
Exactly. Instead of ruining him, Calhoun's vote turned Van Buren into a political martyr. The outrage propelled Van Buren onto the 1832 ticket as Jackson's new vice president.
And effectively guaranteed him the presidency in the election of 1836.
Yep.
So the little magician, as they call him, finally gets the big chair.
He does.
But his prize is a nation on the absolute brink of economic disaster.
Yeah.
Almost the minute he sits down in the Oval Office, the Panic of 1837 hits.
Just brutal timing.
Banks in New York suddenly stop converting paper money into gold and silver.
It was an unprecedented economic collapse that triggered a severe 5-year depression.
Wow.
The root causes were complex, rampant land speculation, a lack of hard currency, international financial shifts. When the public panicked and tried to withdraw their hard specie, the banks simply didn't have it in their vaults.
Wait, let me pause here because I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of his response.
Okay.
Van Buren refuses to have the federal government step in and bail people out. Instead, he focuses his energy on creating the independent treasury system, which divorces federal funds from the private banking system.
Right.
So, in plain terms, is he basically taking the government's cash out of the banking system and stuffing it in a giant federal mattress?
That's a great way to put it, actually.
How does that actually help a failing economy?
Well, in the short term, it doesn't offer immediate relief to a suffering public.
Which made him pretty unpopular.
Very unpopular. But the logic behind the independent treasury was preventative. If the government keeps its money in private banks, those banks use that federal money as leverage to issue more paper money and back risky loans for land speculators.
Feeding the bubble.
Exactly. When the bubble bursts, the government's funds are at risk. Van Buren's mechanism was to build independent federal vaults. He believed that by keeping government money out of the private market, he could stop the artificial boom and bust cycle.
So it's a strict adherence to his view of limited government. He's prioritizing the structural integrity of the federal dollar over providing immediate comfort to ruined farmers and businessmen.
Precisely. And while the economy is burning domestically, he is simultaneously trying to keep the country from actually going to war abroad.
And a war would have utterly bankrupted the country, right?
Oh, without question.
It would have destroyed the very political coalition he was trying to hold together. So he is absolutely dedicated to avoiding armed conflict with Great Britain, despite some major provocations.
Real provocations.
Like during the Canadian rebellions, British forces actually burned an American ship, the Caroline, and sent it over Niagara Falls.
Such a traumatic image.
The American public and the newspapers were screaming for retaliation.
They wanted war. Then you have the Aroostook War.
Right. Which sounds like a sitcom plot, but the stakes were incredibly high.
They really were.
You have American and Canadian lumberjacks getting into a literal shouting match, sometimes called the Battle of Caribou, over ambiguous timber rights on the border of Maine and New Brunswick.
Yeah, lumberjacks. But it escalated to the point where Maine called up its militia, and Congress authorized 50,000 troops and a massive budget for war.
Wild. So how did he stop it?
The mechanism Van Buren used to handle this was careful de-escalation. He refused to mobilize the military for combat. Instead, he sent General Winfield Scott to the border specifically to enforce neutrality and calm tensions.
So he just talks everyone down.
Right. He insisted on keeping the dispute in the realm of diplomacy, and it succeeded. It bought the time necessary for the Webster-Ashburton Treaty a few years later, which settled the border peacefully without firing a single shot.
So he kept the fragile republic out of a devastating foreign war.
He did.
But the historical record, from our sources, makes it very clear. Keeping his domestic political machine together required Van Buren to make some profound moral compromises.
Yes.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to look at this impartially based on what the historical documents say.
Exactly. The reality of the political machine he designed was that its survival demanded absolute, unbroken unity between the northern and southern factions of the Democratic Party.
Right.
If that unity cracked, the party lost power. And the sources highlight a stark reality. The cost of that unity was often paid by marginalized groups.
The machine required stability.
Yeah.
And Van Buren consistently sided with policies that prioritized that political stability over human rights.
Right.
Take Indian removal. He did not invent the policy that began under Jackson, but Van Buren ruthlessly oversaw its execution.
He did.
He ordered General Winfield Scott to forcibly march 15,000 Cherokee westward in what became known as the Trail of Tears.
The records estimate that roughly 5,000 Cherokee died on that 1,200-mile forced march.
It's horrific.
It is. But to understand the political machine, look at how Van Buren communicated this to Congress. In his official message, he reported that the removal had the happiest effects.
Unbelievable.
He took a massive human tragedy and spun it as a clean bureaucratic success to assure his coalition that the government was functioning smoothly.
Just brutal political math.
Yeah.
And the same strict adherence to coalition unity dictated his actions on slavery.
Yes.
He backed the congressional gag rule, which was a procedural mechanism to immediately table any abolitionist petitions without debate.
Effectively keeping the issue completely off the floor.
Right. And he refused to consider the annexation of Texas because he knew adding another slave state would spark a sectional debate that could tear his party apart.
He wouldn't risk it.
And during the Amistad case, when self-emancipated Africans seized a Spanish slave ship and landed in New York, Van Buren's immediate instinct was political containment.
Right.
He issued an executive order to hand them right back to the Spanish enslavers to avoid international and domestic friction.
Now, the Supreme Court eventually intervened and overturned him on the Amistad case, granting the individuals their freedom.
Thankfully.
But Van Buren's initial maneuvers always prioritized minimizing fallout. The system he professionalized utilized race as a wedge issue and a tool of containment to maintain electoral math.
And he even applied this cold electoral math to religious minorities.
He did.
When early Mormon pioneers, led by Joseph Smith, were facing a literal extermination order from the governor of Missouri, they traveled to Washington to beg the president for federal protection.
Right.
And Van Buren gave them an incredibly blunt rejection. According to the records, he told them, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. If I take up for you, I shall lose the vote of Missouri."
It demonstrates the inherent flaw in the machine. A system designed to standardize voter behavior and maintain national unity is inherently designed to suppress moral crises.
Especially if addressing them threatens the party's grip on power. And the ultimate historical irony of Martin Van Buren's story is that the very machine tactics he invented were eventually weaponized by his enemies to destroy his presidency.
Yes. By the time the election of 1840 rolled around, the opposing Whig Party had learned their lesson.
They took notes.
They realized they could not beat Van Buren with gentlemanly policy debates. They had to beat him at his own game.
Right.
They had to run a coordinated, national, emotion-driven campaign.
So they nominate William Henry Harrison, and they launch a master class in political theater.
It really was.
A Whig congressman named Charles Ogle delivers a speech that lasts for 3 days on the House floor.
3 days.
3 days.
Yeah.
It becomes known as the Gold Spoon speech. He completely fabricates this image of Van Buren as a luxurious, out-of-touch aristocrat who sips soup from golden spoons while the American people suffer in an economic depression.
And in contrast, they packaged their own candidate, Harrison, as a rugged man of the people.
A log cabin guy.
Exactly. They create the imagery of him sitting in a simple log cabin, drinking hard cider. They hold massive rallies, write campaign songs, and use the famous slogan, "Tippecanoe Canoe and Tyler too."
Which, if you look at their actual biographies, is an incredible inversion of the truth.
A fleet inversion.
Harrison was a wealthy, college-educated elite from a prominent Virginia family. Van Buren was the actual self-made tavern keeper's son who had to drop out of school to work.
Right, but the truth didn't matter. The emotional branding worked perfectly.
Yeah.
The Whigs used the infrastructure of modern campaigning to decisively beat Van Buren in the 1840 election.
The architect was ousted by his own blueprint.
He was.
But his career has one final, fascinating epilogue. 8 years after losing the presidency, in 1848, Van Buren makes a shocking return to presidential politics.
This is wild.
Right. He doesn't run as a Democrat. He runs as the candidate for the newly formed Free Soil Party. The very man who spent his entire presidency appeasing pro-slavery forces to keep his national party together now runs on a platform vehemently opposing the expansion of slavery into new Western territories.
Right.
The campaign slogan was literally, Free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. He manages to win a record 10.1% of the popular vote for a third party.
Which presents a super complex historical puzzle.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
This raises an important question. Did Van Buren undergo a genuine moral awakening regarding slavery? Or was this a deeply cynical maneuver to punish the Southern faction of the Democratic Party that had blocked his nomination back in 1844?
Good question. What did the historians say?
Historians remain pretty divided. It was likely a mixture of both a man finding a way to align his personal political grievances with an emerging movement meant to protect the economic interests of white labor in the West.
So what does this all mean? He fundamentally reshaped the landscape on his way in and on his way out.
He really did.
We are looking at a man who served only a single term. He is often forgotten or treated as just a footnote in the shadow of Andrew Jackson. But Martin Van Buren took the chaotic, localized energy of early American democracy and gave it a permanent structure.
He proved that professional political parties could prevent a young, diverse nation from fracturing.
Right.
He replaced the gentlemanly ideals of the founders with the ruthless, effective mechanics of party loyalty.
He kept the fragile republic glued together.
Yeah.
But I want to leave you with a completely different thought to mull over today as we look at the legacy of the political machine.
Okay.
Think about the mechanics Van Buren invented. Standardizing a message, demanding absolute loyalty, and prioritizing the victory of the party over individual nuance.
Right.
If the Albany Regency was the 1.0 version of standardizing voter behavior, are today's algorithm-driven social media echo chambers, where our political identities are perfectly packaged and reinforced every second, just the ultimate automated realization of Martin Van Buren's vision.
Oh, wow. That's a really compelling way to view modern political tribalism.
Right.
The technology has totally evolved, but the underlying machinery of loyalty and containment was engineered 2 centuries ago.
The ultimate legacy of the Tavern Keeper's son from Kinderhook. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of American politics. We will see you next time.